I had officially been invited onto the urban design panel by the then planning president. A whole load of us, including...
Who was the planning president then?
John Maswell.
That was John Maswell.
And there was a whole load of people. There were artists, other artists, there were architects, historians. It was a fascinating mix of people. And that was about 1986, and we were campaigning and arguing that buildings should be listed. And we were getting a provisional list drawn up by one department. Almost at the same time, quite of those few buildings were being given permission for demolition by another department. It was extraordinary the way things were happening with planning. Again, these buildings were listed. There was a nice corner on the shop called the Cosy Cafe, which had its intact shop front. There was a nice fan light in a doorway around the corner in Cannon Street, and a couple of modest cottages. They were listed. They were left empty for so long, they were deemed impossible to repair, and they were demolished, so we lost them. We had the Eagle Tavern making a corner. Another building from the early 1800s, a modest little building, complete with a statue of an eagle on the front from when it became a pub. This too was listed, but just a few years ago, despite being listed, permission was given for it to be demolished, and it's replaced by the building you see now, which contributes very little to the streetscape. The sad thing is that the buildings on both sides of these streets were listed. Further down, the listed buildings remain, so these were an integral part of a group of buildings, and yet we've lost an entire chunk at this end of the street. This is the remaining fragment of what was a whole quarter of buildings from the 18th century, which extended right up Demarich Street as far as Union Street and down Old Street. And of that whole quarter, all we have is this small row here left, which has been restored, and the buildings behind, which is still under threat. The area was mostly a little run down, and it had an awful lot of little junk shops which were evolving by the early 1970s into antique shops. And the area was just starting to regenerate, and if it had been left untouched, it would have become boutiques, restaurants, cafes. It was such a delightful area, it would have become a tourist attraction in its own right. But because there was a decision by the states to clear a whole area, the whole thing was flattened apart from this tiny fragment which survived and hung on until it was restored in the 1990s. Even got in most of the house.
That's right. And I remember the looks on the faces of the group which advised the committee when they were faced with this view of interiors, you know, and this concern with the loss of valuable woodwork and all sorts of things.
And what we have today is a mishmash, a very strange mix of very picturesque little cottages on one side and pretty brutal 1970s architecture on the other side, which is quite hard to love. And it's almost schizoid in its character, this street, being completely two halves. And this is basically what's happened all across St Helier. Behind me is the site of the old Bristol Hotel. This was a nice, modest 19th century public house. The building turned the corner beautifully. The building was intact apart from its window frames, and it was listed. The adjoining building was a very small warehouse which incorporated a granite arch which had been relocated from a farm in Victorian times, and there was a date from the 16 or 1700s on the archway. In between was a slightly more modern section of the Bristol Hotel, which turned out to have been designed by Grayson in the 1930s. It was actually a 1930s cocktail bar on the Esplanade. Sadly, it had lost all its internal features, but the exterior looked more like a post-war building. It was so modern and ahead of its time. All of this was listed, and the planning minister last year gave permission for all of this to be demolished.
On the Weybridge, where they've demolished all the listed buildings and just kept up two walls of the old Southampton Hotel, the developers know that it's meaningless. It's a meaningless exercise. And there's almost a pernicious, they view it as a pernicious will on the part of the planning department to just force the issue and keep two walls up.
Yes.
It's completely meaningless, because as soon as the building is built, it will not be listed.
The sorry site behind me is what remains of the Southampton Hotel, a listed building, originally designated as a site of special interest which would have protected its interior. The entire row of buildings was originally listed, Adjoining the Southampton was a building that had once been known as the Weybridge Cafe, untouched in more than 100 years. It was perfectly intact. Permission was given to demolish it. The two adjoining buildings were part of what was once the Finsbury Hotel, later known as Traders. They were delisted earlier, but they were part of a group of buildings that formed commercial hotels in the Weybridge area, which sprang up after the construction of our harbours in the Victorian era, or even in the Regency era. These buildings were important because this was the commercial hub of Jersey. The Weybridge was where all the trade came in and out of Jersey, all the produce, and the hotels sprung up in response to that vital commercial activity going on at the time. We were lucky in that these buildings, although they had been extended upwards, were still basically the original structures built in the very early 1800s. We should have kept them because this should have been a conservation area. This is the heart of the Weybridge. We don't even have a plaque at the moment to explain what the Weybridge was to people who come over here. In his wisdom, our planning minister allowed the demolition of everything, including the Southampton Hotel, apart from the front wall and a bit of the side wall. A new office block is going to go up behind it, which will actually be slightly bigger, thus reducing the importance of the Southampton. This is what happens when you don't look after your listed buildings. You end up with virtually nothing.
The bigger picture. But of course, don't forget, this touches on that private, public aspect of architecture, where you have a terrace of houses where you know, different owners owned one of the terraces, but there was a graceful exterior, which made it a one. And this is the wonderful thing about architecture. It can be divided up into private parts, but it has a public exterior, which enriches your community.
These are slightly grander houses, dating, I suppose, from the 1830s, 1840s, built much more with the sense of town planning and order. So you have a rhythm of door cases and ornamental features which are repeated on both sides of the street. This is a charming area and ought to be a conservation area. This is a particularly nice triple pedimented door case. Looking a bit sad and sorry for itself. This entire row of houses all had similar pediments at one point. They've lost quite a few of them, but it's the sort of feature that should be restored. This is part of the character of St Helier, but we've neglected everything badly, and this is an area that's actually survived. Some of the things have survived by accident, and one of the bits that survived, which is one of my favourite bits of town, is running through Burrard Street, where you've got the old shops, Miss Foot's shop, and they were all earmarked for road work, and that didn't happen. And because, I suppose, the owners didn't want to put new shop fronts in buildings that might be demolished. That's right. We've got a whole run of wooden shop fronts, which is lovely. It's one of the few bits of town where that survived. Yes. Late 1970s, we finally had a state architect who was enthusiastic for restoring some of these buildings, and therefore we got the first schemes, such as those row of houses in Ann Street, which were the first ones that were saved. They were. Been left.
And actually extraordinary for the time.
Yes.
I'm actually amazed they were saved.
Yes, so we had some... They'd gone back, they'd used the idea of a courtyard, they'd gone back to that idea, they'd reinterpreted something that was traditional here, and that seems to be the only time that Jersey made a conscious effort. That where you do have buildings that have been protected, they are immediately surrounded by huge mountains of concrete. We're getting these outer scale buildings, but what we've got is a lot of, I think, rather poor construction, rather poor design at the moment. That which is trendy is, just because it's modern does not mean it's good. Just because it's modern doesn't mean it's bad. A good modern building is marvellous. I love modern architecture, that enthralls me. What we've got is a lot of mediocre stuff. Yeah. And rather poorly put together.
And also built a very bad quality.
Built a very bad quality.
This is another problem.
And the lifespan of modern buildings seems to be exceptionally short compared to the age of buildings that we're campaigning to save.
Well, I think it's this quality issue that's the problem. I mean, you know, you have a two-dimensional building, but if you don't have good quality materials, I mean, it just denigrates. It just degrades in the atmosphere. And we're seeing that everywhere.
Some of the modern cladding panels, I've seen stuff being used over here. I've seen it in the UK where it's a couple of years older. Really starting to go at the edges, and they look shabby, and then they're very difficult to maintain, short of recladding the entire building.
That's right.
One of the bedrocks of our tourism industry was people coming over to Jersey and found it charming.
Yes.
And what we never used to have was people coming over to Jersey, walking through St Helier and bemoaning how ugly the place was, which is what tourists now do. They look at our waterfront and say it's horrible.
Yeah.
They don't like what we've done.
No, they don't.
I take the list of buildings, I take it out of the minister's hands altogether.
Absolutely.
Completely separate body.
I think it should be a separate body, a separate committee of people who actually do know their subject.
What survives seems to survive more by chance than by intelligence over here.
Well, shall we have a cup of tea?
I think we should have a cup of tea, yes, it'd be really nice.